In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. This last week or so, you've probably been following some of the discussion around the appointment of the next Supreme Court Justice. When our nation undergoes this process, it's fairly common to hear pundits talk about the candidate's philosophy of interpretation, or what it means for them to interpret the law in the truest sense. In the case of Neil Gorsuch, people have been talking about how he is an originalist and a textualist, meaning he thinks the Constitution should be interpreted as the Founding Fathers would have, and that statutes should be interpreted literally without necessarily looking at the legislative history and the law's underlying purposes. This is in contrast with justices who support the idea of a living constitution, meaning that the text adapts to the times and takes on different meaning depending on when it's interpreted. As we follow these discussions, it might spur us to consider our own thoughts on what it means to interpret a document, like the Constitution, faithfully. We might even note similar dichotomies in Christianity when it comes to how we interpret the Bible and whether its meaning is fixed or living. As all of this conversation around interpreting the laws plays out at the national level, it's interesting that today's gospel reading is also about interpreting the law. But in this case, it's about Jesus who is interpreting the law of Moses. In this passage, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus quotes 4 laws from the Torah on the somewhat sensitive issues of anger, adultery, divorce, and the taking of an oath. Then he gives his own interpretation of what it means to keep those laws and to live righteously. The first law he addresses concerns anger. Jesus says, "You have heard it was said, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or a sister, you will be liable to judgment." Now, equating anger with murder might sound a little severe, but we have to take into account Jesus' own example here. The Bible records Jesus' anger, like when he turned over the tables in the temple, or when he cursed the fig tree. But we know that Jesus was without sin. So it seems that this isn't an absolute denouncement of anger, but rather a caution regarding what one does with it. Does anger provoke one to do harm, or is it channeled into something more positive and productive? Does anger set the tone in one's relationships, or is it a precursor for self-reflection and reconciliation? Ultimately, the point he's making here is that while the Torah forbids murder, not murdering is not enough. His followers are to examine their anger, avoid sin, and strive for health in all relationships. In the second command, Jesus says, "You have heard it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, this may seem a bit extreme. For how can one prevent a thought that pops into one's head? Not to mention that sexual thoughts and desires are part of how humans are wired. In some cases, denying that they exist can lead to unhealthy sexual expression and even abuse. It wouldn't make sense for God to demand something impossible, such as preventing a thought from coming into one's mind. But biblical scholar Edwin Christian Van Driel suggests that this isn't what Jesus is asking. His translation of the Greek is, anyone who looks at a woman in order to lust after her has committed adultery. Reading it in this way perhaps makes more sense because then Jesus' instruction is not an injunction against human nature or sexuality, but again, a caution with what one does with it. He's saying that we aren't to look at another person in order to lust after them. We aren't to nurture lustful thoughts. And this goes for men and women. No one should regard another human as a sex object, for every person is a child of God, a unique, complex, thinking, feeling being who can't be reduced to an object of pleasure. Jesus is saying when you look at someone with the intent of objectifying them and reducing them in this way, it's wrong. As for the part where he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, I don't think he means this literally. Though for all of the people who profess a literal reading of the Bible, you might think we'd have a few more one-eyed Christians. But by giving this dramatic example, he's saying, do whatever it takes so that you're not in a position to sin, even if it means taking decisive action. Because the sin of adultery is serious, and so are its consequences. The third command is on divorce. In this passage, Jesus says that anyone who divorces his wife except on the grounds of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. In this case, we might wonder if this law still applies to us or if our thoughts on the matter have evolved. We may even disagree with Jesus' claim. Perhaps we know someone who is in a marriage that needed to end, or perhaps we have been there ourselves. But here again, as with the previous commands, it seems that Jesus is concerned with looking beyond the mere letter of the law. In other words, just because there is a provision for divorce in the Torah doesn't always make it the right course of action, nor should it be taken lightly. For Jesus, marriage signifies the intent of a lifelong commitment. Division or rupture isn't God's desire for human relationships, especially in marriage, but nor is it what partners hope for at the outset. Still, we know that sometimes divorce is necessary. This is why the Torah allows it and why we acknowledge its necessity at times. Jesus isn't negating this law outright, but reminding us to take marriage and divorce with utmost seriousness. Finally, Jesus speaks to the taking of an oath. You have heard it said, do not swear falsely, he says, but I say, do not swear at all. Again, this is not to say you should never take an oath. However, oaths are problematic for Jesus because the very need for having an oath suggests that we make two types of statements, ones to which we are committed and ones to which we may or may not be committed. Jesus expects our full commitment in all our speech. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, speak honestly, don't lie or mislead others. Let all of your words be dependable and true. By interpreting the Torah in this new way, Jesus emphasizes how keeping the law isn't just about avoiding harm or punishment. It goes beyond simply doing what's within one's right. Following the law in the truest sense means loving and obeying God with one's whole heart in both intent and action. Going back to our discussion of judicial philosophy, it seems that Jesus' hermeneutic is rather unique. His reading isn't necessarily literal because he takes a command like, "You shall not murder," to mean so much more than just that. He adapts the law to encompass a wider range of behavior, which may be consistent with a living interpretation, but he also tries to get at what he considers God's original will or intent for humanity. Jesus changes the law in order to arrive at God's intention, which means that this is how we should read him too. When we interpret his instructions, we should be most concerned with his intent or will for us. And as we see from his interpretation of the law, this actually demands more from us than a literal reading. As followers of Christ, we are always interpreting the laws of God in order to apply them to our lives. If we follow Jesus' example, we take these laws not just as a list of behaviors to avoid, but we seek God's heart in them to know what is best in us and what is best for us. We let God's intention guide our speech and our intimate relationships and our dealings with one another. In today's reading from Deuteronomy, God tells the people of Israel that obedience to the commands is the way of choosing life and living in abundance. God's desire is that we will enter into the fullness of life and flourish as human beings. The laws give us insight into what that means for how we conduct ourselves. May we interpret and follow God's commands faithfully, that we might live abundantly. Amen.